camera out. And the last thing I want to talk about is kind of related to our story wranglers, more so than myself as a data wrangler. But there was also like they're synthesizing lots of literature and like what they can find that's published in some form. And we know that there's biases in what's published out there and what's available for us to like actually consume as people doing research. So if something isn't published, they can't factor that into their synthesis. And so there's some uncertainty with some of that stuff that we can talk about a little bit more later.
All right, so this is sounding, I don't know, maybe it's a little complicated, maybe there's a lot going on. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about how we tackle these things. So we know there is this variability and therefore uncertainty in the world. And I don't know, Max, you're sitting there in San Francisco and I think earthquakes. You mentioned something about forecasting earthquakes. What is that all about? Tell us a little more about this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kate. So let's start with what we do know, because uncertainty is a lot of what we don't know or don't know yet. So what do we know? We can't predict specific earthquakes. So that's where I start off the story always, because people always think, well, can we predict when that big earthquake's going to happen? No, sorry. We probably won't ever be able to. But we know that earthquakes will trigger aftershocks. There will be further earthquakes after any big earthquake. And those aftershocks will follow well-known laws of seismology that tell us how many aftershocks will that first earthquake, the main shock, trigger. Where will they be? When will they happen? Okay, so we can put all of those pieces of information together, the how many aftershocks, where and when, into a spatiotemporal model that can forecast the aftershock rate. So it can forecast the number of aftershocks that are expected in some future period, so like the next week after the main shock, the first earthquake happened, for a particular location. And then we can map the forecast for all of those different locations, and we can see how that forecasted number of aftershocks for the next week varies over the region that was affected by the main shock. Okay, so we can make such forecasts, and these forecasts have been being made by the US Geological Survey in an automated forecasting system since 2018. So since 2018, after any magnitude 5 or larger earthquake in the US or its territories, the USGS puts out this aftershock forecast that explains the number of forecasted aftershocks for the next week, the next day, the next month, for different magnitude levels. And it's already being used by a lot of different audiences. So engineers will use that information to decide when to start the inspection of buildings that are damaged by the main shock. Emergency managers will use that information to allocate resources across the affected area by the main shock, and to know how to prepare their teams that are doing search and rescue following that main shock, the first earthquake. The media uses this information, the public information officials use this information to communicate the risk of further earthquakes to a public that's already kind of terrified from what they just lived through. So this sounds great, right? We have this really useful information, a lot of people using it already, but there's a lot of uncertainty in these forecast models. So remember I said we couldn't predict specific earthquakes. Never have been able to, probably never will. What we can do is make these probabilistic statements about the whole collection of aftershocks that we expect for some future period, for the next week or the next year after a big earthquake. And so we have these probability distributions around those forecasted numbers. And sometimes they can be really wide. Those probability distributions can contain a lot of uncertainty. So why? Well, those laws of seismology that we build our forecast models around, they all have parameters that describe like the rate of earthquakes or when they'll stop, where they'll reach. And those parameters need to be estimated from the data and ideally estimated for each specific aftershock sequence. And so early on in the sequence, we don't really have a lot of data. And in general, that estimation of those model parameters comes with a lot of uncertainty. So we get uncertainty from this estimation task we have to do to actually put numbers in these parameters to run the models. But then the earthquake data itself comes with some uncertainty. We don't know exactly where an earthquake took place or how big it was. That's kind of triangulated from all the stations in the seismic network talking to each other as the ground shakes from any given earthquake. And that can also be kind of complicated by a lot of earthquakes happening at once during an active aftershock sequence. So earthquake data comes with uncertainty too, that kind of varies with time. And then aftershock sequences have this special thing about them to make matters even more fun, which is that if one aftershock has a larger magnitude, well, it'll trigger its own aftershock sequence. And so we don't really know what those aftershock magnitudes will be. We don't know how big they'll be. Each aftershock has a magnitude that's like a random draw from an exponential distribution, basically. And so you have the situation where you may have way more aftershocks than forecasted because one can go off with a high magnitude at the end of that exponential distribution that creates way more of its own aftershocks. And so in addition to all the sources of uncertainty we have, these aftershock distributions are really skewed. So it's not like the example that Kaitlin gave where you have between 5 and 9, that's your 95% confidence interval. You can have between like 5 and 90. And so that creates an additional kind of complication to the uncertainty communication problem that we have with aftershock forecasts.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here is Caitlin's telling me that weather is really uncertain. You're telling me that earthquake aftershocks are really uncertain, but like, I really want to know the weather and I really want to know if there's going to be an earthquake, right? Or an earthquake aftershock at least.
Yes.
So we still need to communicate all of this in some way, even though the data are complicated and messy.
Yes.
And that like crux of communication, Jen, that's something that you've been thinking about, about science communication more broadly. So could you tell us a little bit about that, maybe touch on how uncertainty fits into it, and if it's similar or different than some of these other things that you've learned about how to be effective when we have to talk about these complicated things?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And Max, that's fascinating to hear your challenges with uncertainty. We could dig into that a little bit more, but I do think that thinking about uncertainty and how we communicate that is one of the fundamental challenges of science communication. It kind of really encapsulates what's difficult about it, right? Because it's a concept that's really important for applying science, not only, how we think about what we're learning about the world, but how we apply that information. And it's incredibly confusing for people outside of science to understand that and what that means and how we have to think about what actions we can take given our body of scientific understanding. And confusion, as I think we've seen in society now, can lead to fear, it can lead to anger, it can lead to all sorts of things. It's imperative, I believe, I'm an evangelist for this, that as scientists, we have to do a better job of this. And for us, we lean on story, we lean on narrative. I don't think there's a better way for our human brains to try to understand things that are confusing to us. And for us, when thinking about that, we have two crucial ingredients that we need to incorporate into topics that are confusing around science, and that's trust and simplicity. And I think, scientists aren't known for their simplicity. That's a challenging one, but it makes sense. And trust, I think, it's so fundamental to how we operate now as a society. And the data are showing that people are starting to lose trust in institutions that they once trusted, institutions that are made for, the public good, that apply science, that, we have to take a closer look at those two things. And I'll just give a quick example of a way that we've had to try to apply that in our own work. It's not earthquakes, but it's Pacific salmon. So I'm in Seattle right now, and here in Seattle, recovering Pacific salmon is a humongous deal. And recent work that we've done with the state agencies and the federal agencies that are tasked with recovering imperiled salmon populations has focused on how can we do a better job of communicating the process of salmon recovery with all these different groups who have really strong emotions about salmon, whose core identities are often wrapped in their ability to harvest salmon, and a deep history of mistrust across the board. How do we not get stymied in lawsuits and conflict? And the scientists, the fish biologists behind this, they need to come up with numbers for harvest that are against this backdrop of uncertainty, as both Max and Kaitlin have talked about. We don't know exactly what salmon are going to do out in the ocean. We don't know the ocean conditions of that year. We don't know, what the hatchery return is going to be. There's all this uncertainty that must be factored into these decisions. And when the people who have a stake in that don't understand that process, that handling of uncertainty can be construed as bias. Oh, you're biased in favor of this other group, or it can turn into anger and erode the trust in that process itself. And so we have used narrative as a way to try to get people to understand that better. And I think the trust in that narrative comes from who is telling the story. And maybe we'll have a chance to dive into that a little bit more, but thinking about who is going to explain this process of uncertainty to which audience. A staff member at the agency is going to describe that to an audience of, let's say, recreational fishermen and tribal members in one way. But that recreational fisherman who understands it will explain it to their people in a totally different way, and in a way that's rooted in relatability and understanding of what the values of that audience is. So, I mean, I guess to some, it's a complicated topic. It underpins everything that's important about science communication. And while every kind of unique case will be different, I think trust and simplicity is the core to getting people to understand how we apply science given the uncertainty that's inherent in that.
Jen, I love this. I have like a million questions, but before I ask that, first of all, I want to remind the audience that you too can ask questions. So please use the Q&A in the chat. But I want to pull a thread from the beginning of your answer, Jen, about we as humans and our human brain, because I know, Max, you've been taking some cognitive science approaches to thinking about this, because as it turns out, much as I'd like to pretend otherwise, I am not an automaton. So can you tell us a little bit about that, Max, and sort of what does that even mean? How do we think in a quantitative way about this? And then we'll talk some more about some of the qualitative approaches.
Definitely. And yeah, Jen, that was such a fascinating response that got me thinking about a lot of things. So I also have questions that I hope we can get into later too. So in my doctoral research at the University of Washington in Seattle, I worked on quantifying uncertainty in these aftershock forecast models. And then with those better uncertainty estimates, thinking about several different ways of visualizing the uncertainty on a forecast map and testing those different approaches. And so I worked, as Kate mentioned, with cognitive and decision scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, Germany. And that really influenced my thinking on this problem of uncertainty visualization. So I think we have a slide that shows three different approaches we took. So three common ways that scientists will often visualize uncertainty on a forecast map. So the first one, the simplest one, is just to show the forecasted number, like the mean or the median of your forecast distribution on one map. So this is the adjacent approach in the top left here. So this kind of heat color map shows the like median of the number of aftershocks we forecasted for each of these grid cells for some region that was affected by a big earthquake, a main shock. And then adjacent to it, to its right, is the uncertainty of that forecast, maybe the standard error of the forecast distribution, or some measure of the uncertainty. Here we just grouped it into low, medium, and high levels. And so this is for the same area. On the left map shows the median forecast, and the right map shows the uncertainty of that forecast. But we could also use visualization techniques to combine those two pieces of information into one map. And a common approach from the visualization literature is to use the transparency of the forecast color to represent its uncertainty. And so that's what we did in this map on the far right, the transparency approach. We took the same heat colors for the kind of median forecast level, and we varied their transparencies to represent the uncertainty of the forecast at that location. So the more transparent the colors, the kind of more rubbed out they are, the higher the forecast uncertainty. This commonly gets kind of good results in experiments where they evaluate different forms of uncertainty visualizations. Now, in the bottom left, we have what we would say is maybe the statistical approach to the problem. Show like a confidence interval to represent the uncertainty of some forecasted value. So on the left map here, we have the lower bound of that confidence interval for this whole region. So the lowest number of aftershocks that's reasonably likely. And on the right map, we have the upper bound, the highest number of aftershocks consistent with our forecast. And even though that doesn't explicitly show the uncertainty, we can kind of infer the uncertainty by comparing the colors. So the colors for the same location across the two maps. So we can see, in the top left corner of the map where the colors are really different from each other across the two maps, that area has the highest uncertainty, or is an area of high uncertainty. Okay, so those are two approaches, or three visualization approaches. But then we thought, okay, what is it that we want these uncertainty visualizations to accomplish? So we interviewed some emergency managers in Washington State. Remember, I said emergency managers are a key user of aftershock forecasts. And they told us in those interviews that there's two kind of main things that they want to be able to do with these maps. They want to understand, where are the sure bets on the map? So where are the locations where we can expect some aftershocks for sure next week, and locations where, okay, maybe we shouldn't expect any aftershocks. Really, like the forecast is low and the uncertainty is also really low. And then they wanted to understand, where are the potential surprises? So where are the locations on the map where the forecast might be low or kind of middle, but the uncertainty is so high that there could be a bad outcome there anyway, especially because of this really long skew of the forecast distributions for aftershock counts. And so we thought about, how can we set up an experiment to test how well these three different uncertainty visualizations, adjacent, transparency, bounds, how will they communicate potential surprises and sure bets? So in the next slide, I show kind of an example of the task that we did, or that we had folks do in this large experiment. So if we can shift to the next slide. So basically we had two locations on the map where they were paired such that they either had, so we had two locations on the map. There we go. It's a lot easier when I can show you what you see. So for sure bets, the two locations had low uncertainty. So here you can see locations 1 and 2, they're both this darkest gray, low uncertainty, but there's a clear difference in the forecast median. And so here, location 2 is the sure bet to have more aftershocks next week. That's the question that we ask people to answer. Where will there be more aftershocks next week between these two locations? And so when they both have the same low uncertainty, the one with the higher forecast, that's the sure bet to have more. But how about when they have a difference in uncertainty? So here we have the two locations have the same low forecast median, but there's one that has a much higher uncertainty than the other. And here, location 2 is more likely to be that potential surprise. Because of its high uncertainty, it could get shifted way into the tail of that skew distribution. And so that's the one that is more likely to be the surprise. And so we asked people to answer this question with one of the uncertainty visualizations, and we gave them a bunch of different trials. And so what we found, just to sum it all up, is that the adjacent and transparency approaches communicated well these sure bets, the easy kind of task of communicating when both locations have low uncertainty. But the only one where people understood that location 2 is more likely to be a surprise was the bounds visualization. And we think that's because in the bounds visualization, well, you can actually see the worst case scenario. It's right there in front of you. You can see that location 2 there would, blowing up in red on the upper bound map. And because of the cultural connotations and kind of perceptual implications of seeing that dark red color, you can quickly and effectively pull out the surprise cases from that uncertainty visualization. So that's summing up a big paper that we published a couple of years ago on this work, and I hope that intrigues people to read more. We actually have a lot of other results on which judgments here were faster between the three kinds of maps, where people had more confidence in their decision between the three kinds of maps, which kind of goes back to a question of trust and user feeling of confidence in decision making with uncertainty visualizations, and that's all in that paper.
Well, so first of all, for anybody who is listening to this, when we post this video online, we will post it with links to Max's papers, as well as some of the work that Jennifer's done, and GWSC's work. But the thing that I want to carry this through to now, Max, is this question of surprise and trust and how they're linked, right? It's hard to, you're talking to a woman who really did not enjoy the only surprise party that she ever received. Surprise and trust are a hard thing to couple. And so, Jen, I want to come back to you because it seems like that's sort of the crux of the salmon story in a lot of ways. We don't know what's going to happen, and yet we need trust of the stakeholders. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I want to bring in an example that when I was looking at your maps, Max, made me think of something. So when we were doing this story for on Pacific salmon and recovery, in this case, we were really also trying to build some empathy across groups. So not only trust with the scientists, but also trust in each of the stakeholders. And in this case, it was farmers, it was the tribes, and it was recreational fishermen, who historically have really not gotten along when it comes to this issue, and to create some empathy across those groups in order to streamline the process of coming up with solutions that hopefully work, at least in some capacity, for everyone. And so we really wanted to make sure we brought the right people's voices into the picture, first of all. If somebody from, let's say, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is the person saying, here's what we need to know, and this is why you need to know it, that may work for some things, but really what we wanted to do was find a recreational fisherman who was visible in the community and vocal, and say, and who was open to this process and understood it in a better level, for him to speak to his groups and also show that he was willing to, reach out with an olive branch also with the tribes and the farmers to say, we all actually really want the same thing. We want more salmon. Like, and I remember this one moment where he was pulling up some kind of data map about, it was modeling ocean conditions. And he was talking to me on the side. We were going to interview him on camera. And he's like, look at these maps. And do you see how, so he was like, he took that information that you do, Max, and he was able to understand it. And then what we did was kind of the next step in that we brought his voice into the picture, and he was explaining to his people about that process and why it was difficult and why, uncertainty. He doesn't say uncertainty. Of course, he doesn't use any of those terms, but he was a relatable voice and a trustworthy voice for the people he was speaking to, that this process is hard and it's complicated, and there's all these different things that factor into it, but we must trust the process and we must show up at the table. And we must understand that these other groups also, we don't want to, he said something I loved. He said, we shouldn't be fighting with the tribes over the last fish. We need to be bringing more fish, and so just him saying that himself, with the trust that he's earned with his own community, went so much further than anybody else we could have put on camera to do that. And I think that, as we're starting to lose trust in institutions as a whole, as a society, putting the time into building relationships with those members of the public who will help take your story and carry it is huge. And I kind of want to move away from this idea of science communication, and it's more like science engagement. It's like, you have to build a relationship. You can't just say, here's a clear way of saying this, and now let me walk away and you go forward and take this treasure trove of information I just gave you. It's finding the guy, the recreational angler, who can take that story and make it palatable for the audience you need to be on board in order to get something done in a way you think is scientifically sound. So I think that is huge, and it helps you. There's all these other things I could say. Avoiding jargon, I think, is huge. I think we're all starting to gain understanding of that as scientists, but I really want to emphasize, especially when it comes to uncertainty, that idea of trust, and that trust comes through relationships with people who can be your trustworthy messengers for your audience. I don't think we can do it all on our own. We need those other people involved.
I love that. And I feel like that really speaks to the first question that we've gotten from our audience about how do you suggest going about that process of building trust? Is there an answer other than time?
I wish there was a shortcut to this, because it would make things a lot easier, I think, and maybe for scientists at least, but I don't think there is a shortcut. I think, I talked to one of my former lab mates who's now a professor. He was talking about lamenting something about being a teacher these days and saying, oh, the kids don't know right now what expertise is, like how to identify it and how to gain it. I think because we're just awash in all this information. And I think that when we are confused about a topic now, we're going to go to whatever source we think we can trust. And a lot of times that might not be where the expertise is. Trust and expertise aren't a given that they go together. And so if we want the people with the expertise to be guiding how we make decisions, there has to be this extra element of trust, and trust comes with time and relationships and opening yourself up to those conversations, a lot of times that are difficult. It's showing, I feel like sometimes even the process of what we do, telling a story, and we say, hey, we want to tell this story, and we think your voice would be great, and we want to have a conversation with you about it. I think it opens the door to saying, hey, your opinion matters, or your viewpoint on this matters, and we think it's valuable, and we want to have a conversation about how we do this. Just even an act as simple as that can open the door to trust building. And then after that, it is those repeated touch points. And I think as scientists, we often want to be heads down. We need to do our work, and we want to build on this body of understanding. But if we want to actually apply it in the real world, we need people, and we have to make the time for those kinds of activities.
So related to this, and this comes from a question that is in the Q&A right now, and one of our audience members specifically asked Max about determining where the bounds are on those plots. But I think that this speaks to something bigger that Kaitlin, I know you've brought up, and Jen, you brought up also, which is this question about, simplicity is really helpful. But how do we, who gets to decide what the simple thing is? How do we take this like universe of overwhelming information and make it simple? Who gets to decide that? Do we lose some of these issues about uncertainty or variability when we do simplify to make the message clear? How do we do that?
So I can maybe start with an answer, and I would love to hear what the other panelists think. So I think that keeping users' voices central in making these decisions is critical. So really relating to what Jen has been saying, what is the most central information, the most important information that our users actually want and need in, for example, making post-earthquake response decisions? And so in my postdoc research, we've held workshops with aftershock forecast users from a dozen fields. So from engineers to first responders, to public health officials, to public information officers, to understand their needs from aftershock forecast products. And they have a lot of different use cases, a lot of different decisions that they might make with that information. So from schools deciding on shifts to remote learning, to decisions on where to place medical triage points based on where the future ground shaking is expected. We're not going to be able to create new products for each specific use case. So I think there's two approaches to tackle like this huge number of use cases that will shape, what are the bounds that we put on the lower and upper bound of these maps? What are the most fundamental things that we release to our public? So there's two things that I want to say. First is that if you can make interactive dashboards, interactive systems for viewing this information, then you allow the user themselves to set thresholds. You allow the user themselves to choose what information they need. But of course, it has to be presented with some simplicity up front so that you don't overwhelm the user at first go. And so our approach to understanding how to do that part is by thinking about what are the categories of the use cases that our users have. And so in our work, we've delineated 3 different categories. We have those users who are taking our forecasts as numbers and doing numerical operations, setting thresholds, doing calculations, using them as inputs into their own modeling or numerical decision-making. Then we have those users who are taking our forecasts and doing some sort of like ordinal comparisons across the map, like what is the highest, what is the lowest, where am I in relation to that, and how much more or less am I in relation to what the highest forecast is. And then we have those who are just trying to understand the situation qualitatively. What is the story, as Jen was saying, that I should be telling to my community, to my constituents about aftershock risk in the next week? And so we're trying to optimize our forecast maps and graphics for these 3 different use case categories so that those are available at first glance, and then maybe in interactive systems can be further refined or thresholded in different ways based on what the user needs.
So Kaitlin, what about you? I mean, as you're thinking about taking these really complex multi-layered data sets and like turning them into a single graphic on one page, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, it's funny when you were saying like interactive stuff, I'm like, we hand people a sheet of paper. So that's not an option.
We do too. And I think that sheet of paper needs to be optimized before we jump into interactive stuff, but we're trying to do both at the same time.
Yeah. So I think on our sheet of paper, there's sometimes that I think there's like, okay, where do I want to start? There's some things as like someone who thinks about like statistics and like how we're doing this a lot that I'm like, well, this is the correct metric for us to show. And that metric means very little to the people who are looking at the sheet of paper. So thankfully I work with a team of people who think differently about the world than I do. And we had this really great session a couple of weeks ago thinking about interannual variability of like, how can we say like, like the mean's gonna stay the same, but like the variation around that mean might be changing through time. So how do we show that? And I presented everyone with a range of ways, and I was like, I'm not gonna tell you the way that I think is most appropriate or the best way, but I want like the rest of the team to say like what they thought that was the best way. No one liked the way that I was like, this is the way we should do it. Everyone was like, that's garbage, because no one understands confidence or coefficient of variation. Like that's not something that people think about. It's kind of even difficult for people who think about statistics a lot to like, there's a lot of moving parts with coefficient of variation. But we came up with a way that people really liked, that showed just like each year around that mean where it was. And then you could show like within the time periods, like, hey, like this range is a lot bigger than this range, even though the mean is shifting, and you could like visually compare that, which wasn't a way that I had thought of by myself, but thankfully we had like this team of people that were all thinking about this from different angles and thinking about, okay, how would a government official be able to like quickly digest a map? So yeah, a lot of it is collapsing down things that I think are important to show, and we have to maybe collapse it into like showing a median at sometimes or a mean, and then we could be like, but if you actually want to see the variation, like I'll give you a supplemental page where we can show you all that. And it's also, I think, working within a team of people who think differently than I do is super important. So it goes back into that like trust and who's communicating with whom. Yeah, of getting something that people can actually digest in a way that makes sense to more people than just myself.
Jen, you've talked about this also, that like the balance between bringing people in and bringing people along with you and going deep. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, well, I'm listening to these guys, and it makes me want to emphasize again just the importance of knowing your audience, right? And whether you go deep or you don't go deep, or whether you add a little more complexity or you don't add complexity. Max is talking about use cases. We go through that exercise too, but that is essentially just knowing your audience. Who are the different types of audiences that are going to use this, and how are they going to use it? Or with Kaitlin talking about how do you create this graphic? How do we actually make something visual when we talk about uncertainty? And having your group to test it on, but also just other people could do this through focus group testing too. Like find somebody who you actually want to know that information. You think this is the group we would most want to communicate this to, and show it to somebody if you know them, or if there's any way you could just say, which one of these do you like? Which one resonates with you? I think that is a step that's often skipped, but is crucial to your success. And it forces you, when you have to think about who you most want to receive that information, to really get in the head of that type of person. Maybe, really envisioning how are they going to take this and run with it. And I will also say, in terms of deep versus shallow, like I always think simplicity is the best, even if when you're going deep. I think as scientists, we rarely fall on the side of not providing enough information. my job, I feel like half the time is just getting scientists to cut things out and say, can we take this out? What is it we're trying to do? Okay, does this serve that aim? No, out, no matter how much you think everybody needs to know it, just adding it in isn't going to mean that actually people are going to know it. It might obfuscate exactly everything else and make it so nothing is really retained. So that type of simplicity, knowing your audience, it's just key. And if you can test it out the way it sounds like Max was doing, and Kaitlin, you too, within that group, it's enormously valuable.
We have a question from the audience about how do you convey uncertainty experts whose expertise is not your own? But I feel like what I'm hearing is that everyone is an expert. They're just not necessarily an expert in what you're trying to tell them. So whether they're, recreational fishermen or indigenous people or emergency managers, this process of eliciting information about what do you need to know and what are you trying to do feels like it's really central to this whole issue.
But
Go ahead.
I'll just jump in there and say that, just echo what Jen was just saying, that after understanding what it is people want and trying to design a product around that need or preference, testing is so fundamental. And I mean, I think it's tough because a lot of the people doing the modeling and even maybe the product development don't have much background in some of the skill sets for testing, especially because a lot of them are more qualitative. And I think that speaks to the need for interdisciplinary teams, and especially putting a focus on that skill set as fundamental to the enterprise of making scientific information. And so, we spend a lot of time, a lot of scientific research and effort on testing our models, testing that the science works and hits the mark, but almost none of it on testing whether the thing that everyone sees and uses is doing the same. And I do want to advocate as well for more quantitative and experiment-driven testing, because I do think that you get a rich set of information when you do qualitative focus groups, workshops, interviews. But in order to actually estimate the effects of a given map visualization on meeting a communication goal that you have, I think, yeah, to estimate an effect, you have to collect some quantitative data and do some statistical estimation. And I hope that there could be more collaborations across fields to get better research on that process, that topic as well.
So Max, this wasn't your charge, but I feel like those are great sort of wrapping up words. And I want to give Jen and Kaitlin a chance if you've got other sort of wrapping up words that you want to add to this conversation.
Yes, I do. Kaitlin, would you like to go first, or?
Sure, because yours are probably going to be more insightful than mine. Yeah, I think that what I've learned the most from working with like real people and not just like creating science, because I'm like, well, this is interesting, for myself, right? And like being like, well, this is the correct way to present something, so like other scientists who are in my field are gonna like read it and understand it. It's like this whole mindset shift of there's the best way to do it, and then there's the way that you're going to be able to reach the people who you're talking to. And so sometimes it's through visualization, and thankfully with GWSC work, we also have some text that can go along with that, to say like, we know like the direction of this, but like the magnitude there's uncertainty about. And yeah, it's great to work in an interdisciplinary team to kind of work out some of these things before it goes to the end user. So I really want to shout out to you know, our like story wranglers, Kate and Mike for all their feedback, Misty for, you know, like reining in some of our text and how we're presenting stuff, and then Nick for making everything look beautiful on our team. And, you know, what we're producing isn't trivial, and a lot of thought does go into it. So even if we're showing a mean value and maybe not showing a range around it, it's because that's what we think people can understand at this point, and like working with people through time, you know, as they get used to our products, to like kind of weave in some of this more complexity that we know is probably important for them in their decision making, but starting with something that's less scary to begin with, I think.
Yeah, I'll just sum up by saying that I think as scientists, we're living in this really, really interesting time, in the sense that there is this erosion of trust in the different institutions that are scientifically based. And I think there is a shift in terms of how people get that information. We don't see it in science journalism so much anymore, but there's this kind of direct relationship that the public can have with scientific experts now that never occurred before. And I think things like what Max said, we spend so much time on the research to get our modeling right, but we don't think about that time to strengthen that relationship, strengthen how we have that communication, and maybe a little bit of back and forth between what we're doing and the people who can take it and actually apply it or use it to better the world in some way. That is crucial. And now it's, as much as maybe some scientists aren't keen on this, I think it's up to the scientific community to become that trustworthy source. And not every scientist is going to want to do that, and not every scientist needs to be that, but we need to think a little bit more about that time and effort we put into building that relationship. I think we just ignore it at our own peril.
These are amazing tie-up words, all of you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. This has been a great conversation. I predicted it would go fast, and it went fast. I hope the audience thinks so as well. And thank you to the audience for being part of this in our deep dive webinar series. Once you leave the webinar, you should see a pop-up in your web browser. If you respond, that's really helpful to us to let us know how you thought the event went. If you'd like more information about Jen's work with CaravanLab, their website is caravanlab.com, and their newsletter has communication as advice and all kinds of things you probably want. They're on Facebook and Instagram at Hello Caravan Lab. And Max has recently published several papers that she mentioned, and we will put those on the GWSC blog when we post the link for this webinar. So you will be able to get all of this awesome information and all of these great perspectives. So finally, if you'd like more information about GWSC, we're online at ua.gwsc.org. And thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.